Hey y'all, and welcome back to another episode of the Awesome Sauce podcast, where we dive into some of the most controversial issues and use ethical theories to help you get a better understanding of them and potentially come to your own conclusions about those issues. I'm your host, Maddie J, and I'm going to be your guide into the saucy world of ethics and issues. Today, I have some specialists here with me to discuss the theories and give you some more insight into how to apply them. Our first theory of the episode will be utilitarianism, and the critically acclaimed philosophers Marcello and Angel are here to be discussing the ins and outs of this theory. Gentlemen, thank you for being here, and would you do me the favor of telling me a little bit about yourselves?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having us. I'm Marcello, and I'm just a utilitarianism scholar. Just happy to be here, tell you a little bit more about it.
Yeah, my name is Angel. Thank you for having me here on this Awesome Sauce podcast. I'm also a specialist in utilitarianism, and we'll discuss that a little furthermore.
Thanks so much. In addition to this, we're going to be going over deontology, and Nathan and Penny will be our special guests. Welcome to the podcast. Please, if you'd introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Nathan. It's a pleasure to be here. I internet expert, so kind of learned my way here. But I got a couple certificates in deontology, and I'm happy to explain away.
Hey guys, I'm Penny. I've been studying deontology for decades, and I'd say I'm an expert right now. So thanks for having me here.
Awesome sauce. Now let's get into some theories. Now, the first thing I think we should go over is the easier theory to understand, in my opinion anyway, which is utilitarianism. For our listeners at home, would you give us an explanation of the basic principles of this theory?
Yeah, sure. I'll tackle this one. So utilitarianism is an ethical theory where the primary consideration for determining any action's morally rightness, I guess you could say, is the consequences of that action and their ability to promote happiness, which for utilitarianism, happiness is defined as pleasure and absence of pain. So actions in utilitarianism try to promote the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, basically. But there are a couple distinctions within utilitarianism, and I'll let Angel cover those here.
Yeah, so those distinctions are rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. In rule utilitarianism, we have to follow certain rules that should result in the greatest overall happiness. Those rules come within ourselves, and they can be things such as like don't steal and don't lie, like basic ethical rules. And that is opposed to act utilitarianism, which makes you evaluate between two different consequences and of the actions, and you determine for yourself which action you should take to produce the most overall happiness.
Awesome. And who decides what makes the highest good, I guess?
So the highest good is typically determined by people who have experienced both alternatives. So when you're looking at what you should do between this action or the other, Mill and utilitarianism will say that it's the consensus of everybody who's experienced both of those things, and if they have determined one is categorically better than the other, then that one is the superior. It is the higher good for those two things, and then that should be the one that you would do to maximize the happiness.
So almost like a popularity contest. The one people like the most is the one you do.
Awesome. Okay, cool beans. Next, we're going to discuss deontology. So what are some of the main principles that we should know about your theories?
Interesting enough about deontology, especially after hearing utilitarianism, it's almost entirely not contradicting, but contrasting with it. It almost says the opposite. So, at least from my understanding, is what you guys are saying is it's essentially your intentions don't necessarily matter. It's the outcome that matters. Correct?
Correct. Yes.
So, for deontology, interesting is that it's more so focuses on those intentions in the way he kind of describes. He's the author of the theory. But the way he kind of describes it is he calls them like maxims or like your reasons to act, essentially. A little more than just like your intention. But what his whole theory essentially argues around that it's not necessarily the results of your actions that matter, but it's kind of that reasons to act that produce those actions that matter more. And his biggest, almost greatest argument, I would say, within his theory is this sort of categorical imperative that like categorically, like no matter the reasons or the circumstances, is that your maximum or your reasons to act essentially should always hold to be like the best reasons to act. Like you shouldn't be like your reasons for doing one thing shouldn't only be just because of that. Like it shouldn't only align with that certain circumstance. It should, no matter the circumstance, always be a good will, is kind of what he's arguing there, is like his morality.
Part of Kant's categorical imperative is to always treat individuals as an end and never as a means. And to apply that, for example, let's say you're at Costco and they're giving free samples of ice cream, but you already got your free sample of ice cream. But you want more ice cream. So to do that, you consider lying to the person to say that you haven't gotten your free sample yet, even though that's a lie. So in that case, you'd be treating the person as a means and not as an end, because you're taking advantage of them to satisfy your own desires.
Another really like important example that Kant uses for like that sort of like ends means thing, if you guys didn't understand the Costco, is that he uses, or this example, at least to me, seems like a little easier to understand, is like with like your friend, let's say like Marcello is my friend, even though I just met him. But anyways, let's say I asked Marcello, can I have $20? Marcello, can I have $20?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. Now, my intention there should be to essentially return that $20. Like I'm not just asking Marcello, hey, can I have $20? And then going and spending it and just never bringing it up again. Because that is essentially what Kant is arguing is what is a wrong thing to do, is to make this in sort of promise, is what he says, is by asking Marcello for the money, I'm asking to borrow it with the promise that I will return it to him, or with an interest rate, or however the deal goes. But essentially the way this goes in terms of treating him as a means, not an end, is that if I just took his money, I would be treating Marcello as a means, because I'm essentially just stealing like it, very, very simple, versus treating him as an end, where I'm not only satisfying myself by using the money for what I needed, but I'm also returning it to him and treating him as an end, because at the end of the deal, both parties are compensated. It's not one party's being taken advantage of, is essentially what the ends and not means thing means.
Awesome. Alrighty. So it sounds like both theories have discuss at least something about the good and what should be strived for. What are the main differences, would you guys say, between the good in both of your theories, or are there any?
I think the biggest difference is like what I was saying, like I'm quoting Kant here, but what he would probably say about your theory is that you guys are not people if you do that. You're like animals, because all you do is operate in pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. And he would say that you're very simple-minded, essentially. Not exactly like that. I was exaggerating. But he would kind of basically say something along that lines of like, we're rational beings, so we shouldn't be operating under the same sort of sense of morality, or not necessarily morality, but systems that like a animal or a plant would operate, of like trying to just get as much pleasure as they can, even if there were higher and lower pleasures, like your theory argues. He'd say that's just too simple. We're complex beings. We need something more complex.
I think that for utilitarianism, it benefits a lot from being I guess you could say results based, right? Because it depends heavily on the consequences of the actions. So it's easy to look at the results of actions within utilitarianism and say, hey, was this a net good or was this a net bad, right? Like, regardless of the intentions of the person that acted, right? The consequences and the end results, what that yields, it matters, right? And it's something that we can measure and something that we can kind of try to build off of to get towards more overall good for the most amount of people, right?
Awesome. Okay. Cool. So now that we've discussed the good and kind of gone over what the theories outline and what they discuss, I think we can begin moving on to our issues. So, okay. The issues of the podcast that we're discussing for today in particular are going to be euthanasia and triage. We'll be moving on to that after this short break, after a word from our sponsor.
Are your meals missing that wow factor? Does your food taste like, well, food? Is it time to kick things up a notch with, I don't know, something like awesome sauce? That's right, awesome sauce. The condiment's so awesome that it might make you question every other sauce in your fridge. It's bold, it's spicy, it's sweet, and it's like ketchup. It's like if ketchup, barbecue sauce, and a secret family recipe had a love child. Now, isn't that sweet? And then sent that child to a summer camp for a flavor enhancement, so it gets even better. 1 drop and bam! You're in a culinary genius. 2 drops and your flavor gone. 3 drops and, well, let's just say you might want to warm your taste buds. They're in for a little wild ride. Get yourself some awesome sauce because your food deserves better than meh. Awesome sauce, when good enough, is never good enough. Please use responsibly.
Alrighty, welcome back everybody from that really awesome break. Now let's move into the actual issues that we'll be discussing today. We're going to be talking about both euthanasia and triage. So some of the issues that bring people to choose between life and death for others or even for themselves. And we're going to be going over how our theories that we discussed in the first half of this podcast can be applied to those and how they can help us make decisions about those issues. So first, a brief summation of the issues. Euthanasia is typically the decision between continuing treatment or potentially dragging out a patient's suffering or ending their life, either passively or actively. And it can be voluntary or involuntary. So passive involuntary is actually illegal. So for that case, we're not going to be discussing that. But in the other cases, which would be passive, voluntary, which is essentially just administering or ceasing to administer treatment and allowing them to sort of fade out, but they are consenting to that decision. Or active, which is where you administer some sort of drug or essentially poison that kills them off pretty quickly, and that can be active or involuntary. I believe, yes, if it's by the consent, I believe, of their family. So if they no longer have the means to support that member on life support, they can choose to have that done. But in one way or another, it's intentionally ending the life of that person. And then we'll also be discussing triage, which decides on who gets treatment or who does not. Typically, this is only for emergencies such as hurricanes or other disasters. This prevents the movement between medical facilities, so patients can no longer be transported to receive treatment, or resources that would be used to give treatment can no longer be accessed. So decisions have to be made about who gets treatment, and that potentially lowers the likelihood of someone surviving. So fortunately, this is a lot less likely to happen, but on the off chances that it does, it's important for us to know how to make a decision on that situation. So, the specialists of the hour, how would the theories respond to these situations? Let's start with euthanasia first. Would there be any potential of using euthanasia in any situation, or is it completely off the table for the theories? I don't know.
I think for deontology specifically, is it this kind of like you have like all of these different types of euthanasia where you can and there's two ways that you could kind of look at this from the perspective of deontology. I'll go through with that kind of categorical imperative of like it always being right or the wrong thing to do. I'll let Penny, once I'm finished, explain the other side about the ends and treating people not as a means. But anyways, what I was gonna propose is that with all of these different types of euthanasia, some of them seeming specifically to lend themselves more to maybe us deciding that, yeah, that seems like a scenario like, I don't know, passive involuntary or something like that, where like something changes and then it results in like somebody dying on accident or whatever. I think for all of these situations in general, the deontology theory will tell us is that it's kind of always wrong to do this because it argues heavily that the intentions or that the maxims must always be justified for every situation. So if the intention or the maxim was like, hey, we should take away this patient's resources and take them off life support, whether knowing that they would die or not, it would essentially, that maxim would have to be true for every situation. For every patient, it should always be the right thing to do to take off life support, essentially. And so for that, it can't, obviously, it's not always the right thing to do or the morally just thing to do to take someone off life support. So deontology would then tell us, well, hey, it's not always the right thing to do, therefore we shouldn't do it. And it kind of has a similar argument to this is for lying, is that lying, we may think in certain situations, like somebody's holding a bank hostage and the police officer's calling the bank and trying to negotiate with them. And we may say, maybe if the perpetrator is saying, hey, get me, I'll insert list of demands, the police officer, it would make sense for them to lie, that they're going to give them the helicopter and for them to just come out and give them the helicopter so that they can, from deontology's perspective, essentially take advantage of that person's trust and lie to them, which we would say is like, yeah, that's a good thing to do, is the police officer would be in the right for lying to them so that he can save everyone else's life. But actually, what deontology says is that lying in this situation is always wrong. And maybe this is a weakness of the theory, and maybe not. But essentially what it argues is that in this situation, it may be right to lie, but in every situation where we know it's wrong to lie, that kind of contradicts the ability for lying to be right, because it's not always the right thing to do. And that essentially if you lied in deontology's perspective, it would have to always be the right thing to do. And that can't be the right thing to do because a society of liars would get nowhere. And so that's kind of that response, is that it's not always the correct, like universally thing that you should do. Therefore, you shouldn't do it. It's not morally just.
So because it can't be applied to every patient, that it should not be done? Is that essentially what it's saying?
Yeah, pretty much it's kind of telling us is that euthanasia as a whole is that it's not something that you can always do. Therefore, it's not something you should be doing. And there is a very specific argument against voluntary even that he kind of does, where he talks about that. And I'll let Penny kind of talk about that argument where he tells you specifically more about the ends and means.
Right, so as Nathan is saying, the specific distinctions between euthanasia, passive, involuntary, active or otherwise, they don't necessarily need to be considered from the point of view of deontology, because the act of euthanasia itself would violate the deontologist's perspective, because by using deontology to end someone's life, to end their suffering, or maybe not even their suffering, the person is using themselves as a means to end their own life rather than as an end in themselves. So if every patient were influenced by some sort of suffering or in that condition, you couldn't will that euthanasia always be applied, because they wouldn't treat the patient as an end. They treat them as a means.
Okay, nice. Yeah, that's a really good way to look at it, I think, and I think it provides some perspective if someone is making a universal plan that could be applied to all hospitals, something definitely to take into consideration. What about the utilitarians? What would they say to this?
From a utilitarianist approach for euthanasia, it really looks at it from like voluntary and involuntary, active and passive. From all of them, it really just looks like it makes you look at it on a case-to-case basis, because it all really looks at the results of what euthanasia will do and if it will yield the greatest overall happiness. So in a case where you have voluntary active euthanasia, but it wouldn't result in the overall greatest happiness, then you shouldn't do it. And that's what utilitarianism says, just because it won't lead to the greatest overall happiness than any other alternative. But in the case of euthanasia, where it does lead to the greatest overall happiness, we would say that you should use euthanasia, just so it can lead to the greatest overall happiness.
And just so I can clarify this for whoever's listening, the people who are determining where this happiness comes from, it has to be the patient, because they're both experiencing the pain and they've likely known what it's like not to be in pain. So the happiness has to be determined by them. Is that correct? Or is it society as a whole for this particular case?
I think for this particular case, where it's hard to know, like, in terms of the highest good between life and death. And so I think that when you're looking at that from a utilitarian perspective, you're looking at the pleasure and absence of pain of the people in that patient's sort of orbit, the family or people that might be able to benefit from the organs that person who was euthanized might be able to give, or the resources that they're using to keep someone alive in a coma. Those could be used for someone else who might need them. So I think the determination happens at that level and not so much from the patient understanding, life or death and stuff like that.
Okay, nice. Okay. Well, that does answer some of our questions about how these theories can be applied to the issue of euthanasia. I think we can move on to triage if y'all are okay with that, unless further discussions to be had.
I think we're okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Alrighty, so then triage, just as a reminder, it's just the issue of deciding who gets treatment or who does not. So this one can get a little bit more complicated because there is the issue of who is the healthiest in this situation, who could potentially provide the most help to others if they got the treatment themselves. There's all sorts of perspectives to look at and to think about when considering this. So how should we go about dealing with the case of triage?
For utilitarianism, talking about triage, obviously, as we've said time and time again, you want to maximize happiness. So for a triage method that utilitarianism would say is the most morally permissible, it would just be treating patients that are going to yield more happiness. And sometimes that might look like allowing, not necessarily treating someone who is an organ donor so that their organs could go to more people than just that one person. Sometimes it might look like treating someone who's younger because they have more years of life and could have more happiness in that sort of way, instead of treating someone who might be older. Or sometimes you could have instances where, you have two patients who need treatment that are roughly around the same age, but one of them might, have a more beneficial set of skills, or might be a more, I guess, objectively morally upstanding citizen than the other. Like this other person could have been, some sort of criminal, right? Then you would want to treat that more upstanding individual in those cases.
Okay, it sounds like a very logical way to go about it. Does deontology have a response to this, or even just freeballing?
I actually had a question. So you kind of define so you want to produce the most happiness, which it seems then after you explain all of these different ways you could, and it seems like this sort of idea of happiness is very arbitrary and convoluted, is in almost a way of saying, at least from the way you were describing it, it's like you have all these different ways of determining how should it be the most useful people or the children or that. But it's in an actual situation, which one does it tell us to do? Because it seems like it's almost well, you have all these different options. Well, basically just do whatever you feel like, kind of. So maybe it's when you kind of mentioned a little earlier that kind of levels of happiness. Can you maybe explain how that would apply here, and what would utilitarianism necessarily tell us we should do?
Yeah. So within utilitarianism, there's higher and lower pleasures, and when you have a question about whether a pleasure is higher or lower than another, typically utilitarianism says that in order to derive the answer of which one is a higher or lower pleasure, you would look at everybody who's experienced both, and if there is a majority of people that decide that one is definitely better than the other without any sort of reason to prefer one over the other, then you would say the one that is largely preferred is the higher pleasure, right? Since everybody that's experienced both, or a majority of the people that have experienced both, is going to say that this one is definitely better than the other. That would be the answer. And so in the case of triage, where the higher the pleasures are,
so I'll just take it from here. I think utilitarianism, in a instance where there's triage, it would favor heavily towards the children, just because they have the most years of life ahead of them, or projected years of life, as opposed to someone who's older and in the same instance where they need to pick. And that's mainly just because obviously children can live longer, or will live longer because they have more years of life ahead of them. And I think also that would be more in favor, as opposed to anyone who has a quote unquote useful job, such as an engineer or architect, or just someone who just has a job that's needed in society. I think they would still favor the children just because of the years of life.
So kind of saying they have the most potential kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying? They could grow up and they replace the architect or engineer, essentially. Okay, that makes sense. I think the main way is I've kind of been going off of the categorical imperative most of the time, so I guess I'll look at it from here again for triage. It would kind of tell you whatever you do should be just in every situation. So that's why I kind of point out your kind of all these different outcomes, or all these different ways about solving the problem. Is the way I believe Kant would look at it is whatever the solution is shouldn't depend on the situation. It should be good in just no matter there was no matter the situation. So like similar thing like the euthanasia here wouldn't be justified as like something you should always do. But in this situation where it's something that you kind of have to do, I believe Kant would argue against the potential changing of what it should be and try and pick a more fair route, which I'll let Penny explain a little more about because she's been doing the ends and means.
Right. So Kant's perspective emphasizes the equality of all people. So he wouldn't necessarily be in favor of choosing some individuals in a triage room over others, just depending on their conditions, because everyone has equal capacity as an individual and a rational being. So the method of triage that would most closely align with deontology would be a lottery system where everyone has an equal chance of receiving medical treatment.
Yeah, it's kind of like what I was kind of hinting at for what I was expecting you to say is like Kant's theory. I don't know if we've gone into it too much, but the way his theory, like the reasoning specifically behind it, is where we're kind of getting from this is that he starts off with that sort of categorical imperative that we've hinted at. And I guess we probably should have explained this a little better in the beginning. Is that like his reasoning that he gets through this is through a list of deductive reasoning. Like he starts out in his argument saying, oh, in order for us to have morality, we should locate the highest good. Then he says it's the good will. And then he deduces, well, only a reason to act that is moral could be a categorical imperative. Like it's applicable all the time. And then he's like, deduces from there. He's like, well, that reasons to act can only be a universal law or categorical comparative if it's based out of like the goodwill. It's good all the time, essentially. And then he creates that formula that we've been talking about. And then from here, what he then goes into is he makes his reasoning for equality. So he says, this is my moral law. This is the formula, the categorical imperative. If it's your reasons to act are good, no matter what the situation is, then it's a universal law and you should always act with those reasonings. So he says, if you're a rational being, then you will be able to have the capacity to understand this. So me, maybe Marcello, I'm not too sure, but if Marcello has the reasonable capacity to understand this, not necessarily he's born knowing it, but he has the capacity to be rational and understand this theory, which all humans do, then he would say they're a rational being. So what he says is, I understand this, therefore I am a rational being and deserve to be treated as an end in myself. So I shouldn't be treated as a means. And then by deductive reasoning again, if I'm capable of understanding it and a rational being, and Marcello is also capable of understanding it, then he himself is also a rational being and deserves to be treated as ends. So we should then treat each other as ends, not means, respecting that we are both capable of understanding the moral law. And so that's where he kind of leads us back into like this equality of the lottery system, is that everybody in that situation is, every patient, every nurse is a rational being capable of understanding his moral law, which means that in Kant's eyes, no matter what we do, the only rational thing to do is to treat everyone equally, which means the only way we could truly do that is either give everyone help or no one help. But in this situation, obviously, we're not going to do that. So what would make even more sense is to fairly pick on who gets help with a lottery system, like Penny was saying, where everyone's name is in a hat, where all have equal chances of being drawn, and boom, name out of the hat, that's who gets it, is kind of what Kant would argue the most morally just triage method.
So I think like with your lottery system, do you think it would diminish like any or like using Kant's ideas, like do you think it diminished the idea of like having an unfavorable like result in the draw?
Well, I think, yeah, it essentially, because it's not, I wanted to take away back myself away from it, that this isn't my lottery system. This is Kant's lottery system. He would say that again would not be treating everybody as an end if we are unfavorably favoring certain people. Like if we made children have the highest chance in the lottery, then we would be favoring them over everyone else, which inherently would be saying that they are more important and more deserving of more rationality, I guess, in a way. Or like they're above us, is what that would essentially be saying. They're above everyone else. But in Kant's ethics, everybody's equal. So that would kind of then be a contradiction. If we're favoring children, but everybody is equal, well, then you can't favor somebody and everybody still have equal chances. So he would say that, yeah, everything should be absolutely fair. Maybe he would back up on that and say, well, yeah, I guess it makes sense for children to go first, but solely based off of his argument for his ethical theory, everyone should be equal in those chances.
I'll add on to that by saying or pointing out that this is where one of like the big distinctions between deontology and utilitarianism is. You're asking about like the unfavorable results, but deontology isn't even considering the results that could come from the lottery system. It's the act in considering everyone as equal before making any decisions. That's the important factor.
Yeah, I agree. That is a very insightful thing to highlight. Internet does not tell you that, I'll tell you that.
Great. So, do we feel as though we've reached some sort of, end? Do you feel happy with how you've explained the issues of today's podcast?
I think we all did a pretty good job, except for Marshall.
Some not as rational as we thought.
He's rational enough. No, I'm just no, I think everyone did really well. It was a pleasure to be here and meet all of you guys for the first time in an ethical podcast. I'd like to be featured in more. If you do any other podcasts, you need more internet experts, just let me know. It was a pleasure to meet you guys.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Appreciate it.
Really good honor.
Thank you guys.
Alrighty. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today. And again, a huge thank you to our specialists. And stay tuned for the next one. Obviously, this is episode 105, so we have more to come, hopefully. And remember to stay saucy, my friends. Catch you on the
Marshall,
next
is it true that you studied directly under Socrates?
Yeah. Socrates and I go way back.
How far back is that? Like thousands of years?
Yeah. I'm a lot older than I think. So.
Age can be deceiving, apparently. Guys, this can't make it into the podcast. My problem solving skills are very through the roof right now. I'm in my prime.
Someone might call me a professional.
Yeah, unlike Mike Tyson last night, it pissed me
That
off.
was awful.
I had
Traded
money-
for 3
I had
hours.
money on that fight and he lost.
So how does utilitarianism affect why gambling is okay?
Yeah, what does deontology say about putting a 6-year-old man versus a 27-year-old in the
I
ring?
feel like utilitarianism says gambling is not okay because the house always wins.
Unless you
Facts.
win.
Yeah, because it treats
Yeah.
everyone as a means. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it'd say the same thing that Jake Paul is treating Mike Tyson as a means to get his name out there more. You know what made me so mad is how disrespectful he was at the
Logan.
end of the fight.
Was
Not even Logan. I didn't really care about that. I get that he was just joking, but like what actually made me mad was like whenever he won, Mike Tyson goes to like shake Jake Paul's hand, and he's like completely ignoring him, spraying his little cologne all over the place. I'm like, dude,
That was so
If-
funny.
you're lucky he's not in his 20s because he would have killed you.
Yeah, you had a bit off your ear, man.
I bet they call out Muhammad Ali next.
Yeah, he's gonna
No,
pull him out of the ground.
He's gonna call out like George Foreman, and he's like in his 70s. He's like, because he was like the Mike Tyson before Mike Tyson.
There was a meme that said he's gonna call out Jimmy Carter.
Oh, he's like 100.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if the Queen of England was still around. He'd call her out.
Bro.
She would have dusted his ass though.
Oh, for real.
He's funny. He keeps calling out Canelo. He's like, Canelo needs me. It's like, dude, Canelo's worth 3 times you are. He does not need you.
He does not.
He's like, if
Chilling
Canelo
in
wants a
Molly's.
payday, it's like, dude, he's got